On April 5, 1933, barely a month into his presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. With a single stroke of the pen, the private ownership of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates became a crime across the United States. The order did not ask. It commanded. Every citizen, every partnership, every corporation was directed to deliver their gold to a Federal Reserve Bank or a member institution. The deadline was May 1, 1933, less than 4 weeks away. The nation was drowning. Banks had collapsed by the thousands. Depositors, terrified, had been converting paper dollars into hard metal and hoarding it in mattresses, safes, and vaults. Every ounce pulled from circulation tightened the noose on a banking system starved of reserves. Roosevelt's advisors argued that only by clawing that gold back into government hands could the money supply be expanded and the Depression fought. So the government fixed a price, $20.67 per troy ounce. Surrender your gold and you would receive paper dollars in exchange, dollar for dollar, at that official rate. On its face, it looked like a fair trade. A citizen handed over a coin and walked away with equivalent currency. But the order carried teeth. Compliance was not optional, and the government backed its command with criminal penalties designed to frighten a frightened public into obedience. Newspapers printed the instructions. Banks posted notices. Ordinary Americans lined up to hand over wedding gold, inherited coins, and modest savings, trusting that the law applied equally to all and that their sacrifice served the common recovery. Farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers emptied their holdings at $20.67 an ounce, believing there was no alternative. What almost none of them understood, as they stood in those lines clutching envelopes of coin, was that the order was not a single flat wall. It was a document riddled with carefully worded provisions, deadlines, definitions, exemptions, and one particularly quiet clause. The rich would read the fine print. The poor would read the headline. And before we examine who slipped through, we must first understand exactly what the law threatened to do to those who did not comply. The threat written into Executive Order 6102 was staggering. Any person who failed to surrender their gold faced a fine of up to $10,000, an almost unimaginable sum in 1933, equivalent to years of wages for a working family, enough to buy several houses. Beyond the fine loomed the possibility of imprisonment for as long as 10 years. On paper, the government had constructed a fortress of deterrence. Hoard your gold, and you risked ruin and a prison cell. The language was deliberately harsh, engineered to move a nervous population quickly and completely toward the nearest Federal Reserve window. And move they did. Millions in gold flowed back into government hands within weeks. Yet here lies the first great contradiction of the entire episode. For all its ferocity on paper, the enforcement of Executive Order 6102 was remarkably thin. The federal government did not deploy armies of agents to search homes. It did not kick down doors or audit safe deposit boxes en masse. Prosecutions were almost non-existent. In the entire life of the Prohibition, documented cases of Americans actually charged for simply holding their gold can be counted on a few hands. The $10,000 fine and the 10-year sentence functioned less as active weapons and more as a psychological wall, a bluff of overwhelming force aimed squarely at the law-abiding middle. The ordinary citizen, reading the dire warnings in the morning paper, had no way to gauge how rarely the hammer actually fell. Fear did the work that manpower never could. Compliance became a civic virtue, and surrender became patriotism. But consider who responds to fear of this kind. It is the person without lawyers, without advisors, without alternatives, the school teacher, the widow, the small merchant. The threat of prosecution weighed heaviest, precisely where resistance was weakest, and understanding was thinnest. Those with resources understood something the frightened lines outside the banks did not, that the true opportunities lay not in defying the order, but in reading it closely enough to obey it while keeping their gold, because buried inside that same document were exemptions, legal, explicit, and available to anyone who knew where to look. Executive Order 6102 was never the seamless prohibition its headlines suggested. Read closely, the document was a lattice of exceptions. It permitted each person to retain up to $100 in gold coin, roughly 5 ounces at the official rate, a modest carve-out for pocket change. But the more significant openings lay elsewhere, in provisions written for those whose livelihoods or knowledge set them apart. Dentists were exempt, for gold was essential to fillings and dental work, and they could hold reasonable quantities for their trade. Artists, jewelers, and craftsmen who used gold in their profession could keep what their work required. Industry received its own protections. Manufacturers who employed gold in legitimate commercial processes were not stripped of their raw material. The order recognized that gold was not merely money but also substance, a tool of medicine, art, and production. These were sensible allowances on their face. A dentist could not fill a cavity with a paper dollar. But each exemption was also a door, and doors can be walked through by more than those for whom they were built. The most consequential provision of all was a single quiet clause concerning gold coins of recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coin. In plain language, numismatic gold coins prized not for their metal content but for their rarity, history, or condition was exempted from surrender. A common gold piece was contraband. A rare one was a legal collectible. On the surface, this protected museums, historians, and hobbyists, preserving cultural artifacts. But to a wealthy family with advisors, the implication was electric. The line between an ordinary gold coin worth its weight and a rare coin of special value was not a wall of stone. It was a matter of classification, of expertise, of who could persuasively call a piece collectible. The ordinary citizen in the surrender line had never heard the word numismatic. The informed investor heard it as an invitation. If bullion value gold could be reclassified as a rare and unusual coin, then the metal need never leave private hands at all. And that is precisely the maneuver that dealers and advisors were about to perfect. The rare and unusual coin exemption transformed the gold market almost overnight. If numismatic gold of recognized special value remained legal to own, then the entire game shifted from hiding gold to reclassifying it, and a whole industry stood ready to perform that alchemy. Coin dealers, who days earlier had traded in ordinary pieces, suddenly became gatekeepers of legality. A gold coin melted for its metal was worth $20.67 an ounce and had to be surrendered. That same coin, described as a collectible of special interest to numismatists, could stay in a private drawer indefinitely. The difference was not physical. It was rhetorical, a matter of paperwork and expert opinion. Wealth flowed into rare coins with astonishing speed. Investors who had held bullion or common gold pieces converted them into coins that could plausibly claim collector value. Older issues, foreign gold coins, pieces with distinctive dates, or mint marks. Dealers assembled inventories and advised their clients on which holdings could be defended as numismatic. The premium a buyer paid above melt value was simply the price of legality, a toll for staying on the right side of the order. For a family sitting on substantial gold, that toll was trivial compared to surrendering everything at the fixed rate. Consider the arithmetic. A citizen with $10,000 in ordinary gold could hand it to the government and receive paper. Or he could, with the right advisor, convert that holding into collectible coins, pay a premium, and retain gold itself, the tangible metal, outside the reach of surrender. One path ended in dollars. The other preserved the asset. The exemption was written in the language of culture and history, but in practice it was a wealth preservation instrument available to those who understood it and could afford the dealers who administered it. The school teacher in the surrender line knew none of this. The banker's client knew a man who did. Numismatics became a quiet refuge for gold that would otherwise have been confiscated at a fixed price. But rare coins were only the domestic escape route. For the wealthiest families and largest corporations, an even simpler shelter lay beyond the nation's borders entirely, in the vaults of foreign banks, where American law could not reach. Executive Order 6102 was an American law, and American law stops at the water's edge. Gold held inside the United States could be commanded home, but gold sitting in a vault in London, Zurich, or Paris lay beyond the reach of any federal agent. For families and corporations with international connections, this was not a loophole to be discovered. It was a fact of geography waiting to be used, and used it was. In the weeks before the May 1st deadline, and in some cases well before the order was even signed, metal moved. Those who anticipated the government's need for gold, bankers, financiers, corporate treasurers with contacts abroad, arranged for their holdings to be transferred into foreign institutions. A Swiss bank account denominated in gold or a deposit in a London vault was simply not subject to the surrender requirement. The gold existed, it was owned by Americans, but it stood on foreign soil and answered to foreign law. Switzerland was the natural sanctuary. Its banking secrecy, its stability, and its deep tradition of gold custody made Zurich and Geneva the destinations of choice. London, the historic center of the global gold trade, offered vaults and bullion dealers of unquestioned standing. Paris held its own reserves of discrete capacity. Moving gold there required resources the ordinary citizen did not possess: relationships with international banks, the means to arrange secure transport or transfer, and advisors who understood that the coming order could not, follow the metal across an ocean. This was wealth preservation at its most straightforward. No reclassification, no numismatic argument, no premium paid to a coin dealer. Simply distance. The gold that left American shores captured everything the order was designed to prevent citizens from keeping. While the surrender lines formed outside Federal Reserve banks, filled with people trading metal for paper at $20.67, other Americans held title to gold safely abroad, untouched and intact. Yet ownership across borders raised a delicate question. Who, precisely, owned that foreign gold? For the most sophisticated, the answer could be engineered, hidden inside corporations and trusts, designed so that no single citizen technically held it at all. The rare coin door and the Swiss vault were only the beginning. For the truly wealthy, the most durable protection was not distance, but disguise, achieved through paper. A citizen holding gold was liable, but a Panamanian corporation holding gold, or a family trust registered in Liechtenstein, was a different creature entirely. Executive Order 6102 bound persons subject to United States jurisdiction. Lawyers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia read that clause and went to work separating the man from the metal. The technique was elegant. A wealthy family would incorporate an entity abroad, often in Panama, Canada, or the Bahamas, then transfer title of their bullion to that entity. The shares of the corporation belonged to the family, but the gold on paper belonged to a foreign company beyond the Treasury's reach. Ownership dissolved into layers. A trust might hold the shares. Another trust might hold that trust. By 1933, firms that had spent the 1920s building estate structures for the Rockefellers, the Mellons and lesser fortunes simply repurposed those machines. The gold sat in a London or Zurich vault, and no American name touched it directly. Enforcement, already thin, faced an impossible question. Whose gold was it? To prosecute, the government would have to pierce a foreign corporate veil, prove beneficial ownership, and establish that a citizen-controlled metal held under another flag. The Treasury had neither the manpower nor the treaties to do it at scale. A dentist in Ohio could be visited by a federal agent. A trust chartered in Vaduz could not. The cost of these arrangements was the barrier. Incorporating abroad, retaining international counsel, paying vault fees in 3 currencies, and maintaining the fiction year after year required money most Americans never saw. The structures that shielded gold were themselves a luxury good, available only to those already holding enough gold to justify the expense. So the metal stayed, quietly, under names no one could pronounce, and jurisdictions no agent could enter. It would prove a wise hedge. Because within a year, the government that demanded surrender at $20.67 was about to change the price of gold itself and reveal exactly what the compliant had lost. On January 30, 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, and the trap sprang shut. The act raised the official price of gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce, a devaluation of the dollar by roughly 41% overnight. For anyone who had surrendered gold the previous spring, the arithmetic was brutal. A citizen who turned in 100 ounces in April 1933 received $2,067. That same gold, months later, was worth $3,500 by government decree. The difference, $1,433 per 100 ounces, did not vanish. It flowed straight to the United States Treasury, which now held the nation's gold and revalued its own reserves at the higher price. The government booked a paper profit of roughly $2 billion. The compliant citizen paid for it. This was the mechanism made plain. The May 1st surrender at 20.67 was not a market transaction. It was a purchase at a price the buyer intended to raise the moment the selling was done. Those who obeyed the law harvested nothing. Those who had held gold abroad, or converted it into rare coins protected by the numismatic clause, or buried title inside a foreign trust, watched their holdings appreciate by more than 40% while remaining perfectly legal. The gold in a Zurich vault was worth the same $35, but its owner had never sold. The rare double eagle in a Boston collection was now worth more as metal and more as a collectible. Every legal strategy examined in this film converted, in a single January signature, from caution into profit. The sequence matters. Surrender first, at the low price. Devalue second, capturing the gain for the state and for anyone clever enough to have stayed outside the surrender. The informed had not merely avoided a loss. They had positioned themselves to receive the same windfall the Treasury awarded itself. And then, remarkably, nothing changed for 40 years. The prohibition did not lift with the crisis that justified it. It hardened into a fixture of American life, enforced by silence more than by prosecution, waiting for the rare case that would expose how unevenly it had ever been applied. The emergency ended. The prohibition did not. What began as a crisis measure in 1933 became a permanent feature of American law, surviving Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. For 4 decades, private citizens could not legally hold monetary gold, and for 4 decades, almost no one was prosecuted for doing so. The silence was the story. Enforcement had always been theater. The $10,000 fines and 10-year prison terms written into the order were rarely tested in court, because the government understood the political cost of dragging ordinary savers before judges over family coins. Instead, the law worked by intimidation. Most citizens complied because they believed the threat was real, while those with counsel understood how thin it actually was. Then came the exception that proved the rule. In 1947, a San Francisco jeweler named Gus Farber was prosecuted, and the case of Baraban and related enforcement actions revealed the peculiar geometry of the ban. These were not the great fortunes hiding metal in Zurich. These were small dealers and individuals caught trading gold coins domestically, the very people without foreign trusts or numismatic advisors to shield them. When the government chose to make an example, it reached for the accessible target, not the protected one. The Baraban matter exposed what the whole system had concealed. Enforcement fell on those closest to the ground. The man moving coins in a shop was reachable. The family whose gold sat inside a Panamanian corporation was not. The law's severity was real, but it was aimed downward, at the visible, the domestic, the unrepresented. Meanwhile, the metal held abroad and in collections simply appreciated, untouched, decade after decade. By the 1960s and early 1970s, the entire premise was eroding. The Bretton Woods system strained, the gold pool collapsed, and in 1971 Nixon closed the gold window, severing the dollar from gold in international settlement. The domestic ban now guarded a door to a room that no longer existed. Economists, dealers, and citizens increasingly asked why a Depression-era decree still stood. The answer was inertia and forgetting. But pressure was building toward a single date, a signature that would quietly undo 40 years of prohibition and leave one final lesson behind. On August 14, 1974, Congress passed legislation restoring the right of Americans to own gold, and President Gerald Ford signed it, setting December 31, 1974, as the day the prohibition would finally end. At midnight, after 41 years, a citizen could once again legally hold gold coins and bullion without fear of the fines and prison terms that Executive Order 6102 had threatened since 1933. There was no ceremony equal to the weight of it. Gold dealers prepared inventory. Coin shops advertised. The metal that had been contraband for 4 decades became, at the stroke of a new year, an ordinary asset again. The world had changed around the law. Bretton Woods was gone, the dollar floated, and the $35 price fixed in 1934 was a relic. Gold, freed to trade, would climb far beyond it. Anyone who had held through the long silence, in a Swiss vault, in a rare double eagle, inside a foreign trust, now owned an asset worth many times the $20.67 the compliant had accepted in 1933. But the repeal did not erase the history. It clarified it. For 41 years, the rule had bound unevenly. The dentist who surrendered his coins, the saver who trusted the deadline, the small dealer prosecuted in a rare enforcement action, these had carried the full weight of the law. The families with Panamanian corporations, the collectors advised to reclassify bullion as numismatic gold, the corporations that shipped metal to Zurich before May 1933, these had carried almost none. Same order, same penalties, entirely different outcomes, divided by one thing: access to advice. That is the enduring lesson of the gold prohibition. The law was written for everyone and enforced against some. Its exemptions, its foreign vaults, its trusts, and its rare coin clauses were not secrets, but they were expensive to use, legible only to those who could hire the lawyers, the dealers, and the offshore agents who knew how to read fine print. The gold did not protect the wealthy. Their counsel did. And so this episode leaves a single truth, as true now as in 1933. Rules bind those WHO cannot afford advice.